Okay, and recording has started. So let's kick off, everyone. Apologies for that, but I think it looks like we've got a few people in. I can't actually see the list of participants for some reason, but I am seeing comments from people. So hello to those of you that I do know. I recognized a few of the names over on Yammer. So again, apologies to everyone. So let's talk about the important pieces around what we need to talk about with SMB customers when it comes to security and compliance, and some of the different things we need to think about for practice. So, like, what do we think about when it's a security practice, or more realistic, implementing or integrating security services into some of the existing practices that may exist in SMB-focused organizations. Now, we'll also talk about a few other things that will reach outside of Microsoft 365. So I didn't want this to just be a Microsoft 365 focused session, because there's still going to be a lot of on-prem technology, so I'll make sure that we do cover a little bit of that as well. So some of the important things to take a look at here is we know that the opportunity around security in the SMB space is something that really has grown quite substantially. Over the last couple of years, I think we've finally started to get SMBs to realize that, they can't really sit there and say, well, we're a small organization, we're not important, nobody is really going to target us. The thing that malware has taught a lot of organizations, unfortunately, especially cryptoware, is that they don't really care how big you are. As long as you can provide payment to unlock files that they've encrypted, they're more than happy to take a payment from you. So other challenges that we see, though, and this is something that I called out in the week 1 recording, was that we see that there's an extreme shortage of skills in the security space. So at the enterprise side, they're struggling with salaries they're trying to attract people into in that space, yet alone once we start moving down to mid-market and SMB customers. So we already know that SMBs are going to be a frequent attack vector here, because we know that a lot of them aren't necessarily as up to date. They don't necessarily have the complexity in terms of the different tools they've already got in place. And as I also just mentioned, it's one of those things where some of them kind of, not all of them, but some of them tried to play the, well, if I put my head in the sand, there's nothing going wrong that could possibly go wrong in my organization. So we really need to start changing that, and part of this is just making sure that we start enabling the security capabilities that are part of the base product. And also here, we're also talking about enabling some of the compliance capabilities as well, just to make sure that out of the box there are certain things that we're doing with things that customers are already paying for. Because in a lot of cases, people will just say, well, look, just do the quickest job possible, migrate me. But the end result, though, is you really need to make sure that you're going back and doing, post-deployment maintenance, making sure that you're looking to see, looking for like what kind of breaches, etc., may have already taken place in there. Now, as we move on to some of the reasons why, why Microsoft should be one of the vendors that's considered here. Well, really one of the big things here is just really the sheer scope of data that Microsoft receives around, the different endpoints that Microsoft has. And we'll talk about Intelligent Security Graph as we go through today. But there's a lot of different signals that Microsoft receives. So here they're talking about trillions of signals. Even that number there that they're talking about, the official Olympics website hosted on Azure had 226 million attacks over a course of just 2 weeks. So there's a lot of data that Microsoft receives that's really about making sure that the customer is protected. So it's taking all of this raw data across all of the Office 365 tenants, across all of the Azure AD tenants, across all of the different Azure deployments that are out there, things like Windows Defender signals that are coming back, Windows Update signals that are coming back. So it really means that when we do start looking at solutions like Microsoft 365, there really is the ability to start hooking into a lot of this intelligence that Microsoft has already started supplying. So if we start looking at some of the positioning, now some of this is something that some of you will be quite comfortable with, others will want to argue certain points in here, but these are just examples. It's not to say that, in this case, if we take a look, they're saying that a 10-person selling online concert tickets, saying, well, potentially they're going to be a higher risk than a 200-person construction company. But, even I can sort of look at that one and say, well, it's not necessarily true, because if you think about that online focused organization, you'd kind of hope that if it's an online focused organization that they're a little bit more aware of what they need to be doing to keep things secure. Whereas if you think about that 200-person construction company and the people who are internally looking after paying invoices, et cetera, if you think about potentially the IT skills they've got in terms of detecting, even just looking at an email and going, is this a phishing attack or is this actually from my bank or from one of my suppliers? So some of the examples that they give here, think of them just as examples. They're not necessarily saying that it's necessarily black and white here. But some of the high-risk profiles that they're calling out here, so things like banking and financial, anything where there's some kind of credit card transaction processing. Obviously, healthcare is going to be important, and they've got a whole set of other regulations they need to think about. And then also other high-tech industries. So we're not necessarily talking about IT here. We're talking about research into pharmaceuticals, et cetera, anything where there might be incredible amounts of IP that can be taken in a short time frame. Once we start mapping this out and taking a look at how it fits into the different Microsoft 365 offerings, well, if we take a look in here, some of the things that you'll start noticing is, and this is something we'll focus on as we go through this one, things like the Office Advanced Threat Protection is something that is kind of focusing heavily in some of the scenarios we talk about today, just because of the additional protection against phishing, the safe URL capabilities, the attachment scanning scenarios that over and above what a typical Office 365 customer would be receiving. So otherwise, though, we can look at things like Microsoft 365 Business as that entry-level product. So then as their security risk moves up, we start making decisions around, do we want to increase capabilities by adding things to Microsoft 365 Business? Or alternatively, do we, based on the company's requirements, do we really want to start with Microsoft 365 E3 SKUs? Now, important things to note here is when we look at E3 versus E5 SKUs, think of E3s as the things that start providing some of the compliance and security capabilities. But for those higher risk engagements or customers in higher risk industries or individuals in the organization who are valued or who are seen as high risk targets, that's where some of the additional capabilities of the E5 SKUs start coming into play. So we'll spend a bit of time talking about this as we start going through the rest of today's material. Now, as we take a look at the SMB security staircase here, in this case, starting off with Microsoft 365 Business. So important things to note with this is that it's based on top of Office 365 Business Premium. So if you've got an understanding of what Business Premium offers in terms of, what functionality does it have in terms of security and compliance versus the E3 SKU, for example, that puts you in a good position here. Now, where Microsoft 365 Business's message can get a little bit tougher to decipher unless someone's been through it with you, is that it includes elements of Intune and elements of AAD Premium. Now, on the Intune side, you'll find that it is well documented that it includes the MDM and MAM/Windows Information Protection capabilities can be pushed to Windows 10 devices. But for iOS and Android, it's only mobile application management. It's not managing the device from the ground up. Even though that is something that Intune as a standalone or a bundle in other suites offers, as part of Microsoft 365 Business, it doesn't provide that. When we take a look at the AAD components that are in, effectively it's the Azure Active Directory components that allow autopilot to work that are included. So when you think about the other capabilities that you've got in Azure Active Directory Premium, at least starting with P1, things like your conditional access, the advanced MFA scenarios, the password right back on-prem, these are things that are explicitly not included with Microsoft 365 Business. So as we go through some of this material today, you'll start to get an idea that sometimes the suites as provided might be a great starting point, but there may be other situations where you really do need to start picking and choosing. Now, as we start moving up the staircase here, now this is a variation of one that you did see in week one. But once we get to that second option here, you'll see that, Office 365 ATP is the one that's being added here just because of the, the frequency of, those email type phishing attacks that a lot of SMBs seem to be very, very vulnerable to. So the ability to go through and add that easily to a customer's existing Office 365 E3 alongside their EMS E3 is something that's pretty easy to do. And then finally, once we get over to that final step here, what you'll notice here is they're not trying to just say, well, for an SMB customer, they really should be thinking about Microsoft 365 E5 if they really want security. Because the realities are here that they're probably not, most SMBs are not going to be willing to pay roughly, let's say, $80 per user per month for a Microsoft 365 E5 plan, but they might be willing to spend roughly half of that for a Microsoft 365 E3 and adding Office 365 ATP on top of that. Now, once we do move up to Microsoft 365 Enterprise E3, if you take a look at the list of what's included here, the additional capabilities that we get as we move from that second tier to the third, or from the second item to the third item here, we're really talking about Windows 10 Enterprise capabilities. So it's what we get in Windows 10 Enterprise E3. So even some of the conversations that I'd be thinking of, or things that I'd probably think about here is, if it's an environment where that the customer's hardware is not capable of running some of the more advanced security or the advanced security capabilities of Windows 10 Enterprise, especially those that leverage the hardware-based virtualization, so things like your device guards, etc. It's probably not worth trying to push up to a Microsoft 365 Enterprise E3, at least until they're ready to, or they've either replaced that hardware, or you can make sure that they actually do have hardware that's capable of running some of these more advanced capabilities. Now, some of the other scenarios that you can think of here, well, this is one of my personal favorites, the one on the right here. If someone says, look, the capabilities we get with Office 365 Business Premium do meet my requirements in terms of productivity, and yes, I know that I'm foregoing certain security capabilities once we move up to E3 or E5 Microsoft 365 SKUs. But in this case, what we can do is say, well, if someone says, look, I want Office 365 Business Premium, but I want just a little bit more than what Microsoft 365 Business provides. So I want effectively uncapped Azure AD Premium P1 capabilities, and I don't want there to be any restrictions on the Intune licensing. This is where we can start looking at adding Office 365 Business Premium alongside Intune and AAD P1. Now, you'll notice here that I haven't gone just straight to adding an EMS E3 license, and there's a few reasons for that. Well, in this case, we're talking about just extending the functionality that Microsoft 365 Business has already got in it. We're not talking about adding whole new categories of whole new applications to it. But the other one here is because it's Office 365 Business Premium, we can't really get that full integration of the Azure Information Protection Client into Office like we could in an Office 365 Pro Plus scenario. So even though we can still do a lot of things from the desktop, we can right mouse click on files to do protection and labeling, etc., we're not going to get that same level of integration directly into our Office 365, into the Office 365 Business SKU. Now, if someone says, well, that automatic labeling or some type of labeling and classification is really important to them, then you probably are going to start needing to move that up to a Microsoft 365 E3 conversation if they need Windows 10, alternatively EMS E3 plus Office 365 E3. But again, there's no harm in mixing and matching, but just make sure, especially when you're starting off with Office 365 Business or Microsoft 365 Business, that what you're adding can be fully leveraged with the base versions that are included there. Now, some of the approaches you can take for people who've already got Office, well, what can you do? Well, here they've just tried to present like a fairly simple approach here, but again, you'll see Office 365 ATP featuring prominently in here, just to make sure that people understand that this is something that we recognize in the SMB space, that a customer is not necessarily going to move all the way up to one of the E5 SKUs to get this capability, but it is something that's available as an add-in to these users. So effectively here we're saying, well, if they've got Business Premium or Essentials in Office 365, well, if they're already happy with the functionality there, then just moving them up to Microsoft 365 Business is going to be a pretty good starting point. However, this is where things have been a little bit confusing for people who are working with SMBs and have already sold them E1 or E3 type licenses, is when they say, well, should I look at Microsoft 365 Business for my clients? And generally speaking, if someone's already deployed eSKUs, I just wouldn't include Microsoft 365 Business as part of that conversation because of the potential for them to lose functionality that they may already be leveraging. Because remember, we're not we're talking about the SMB versions of the technologies underneath this, including that Office example I gave. Now let's just start working through and get ready for some of the key pillars that we'll talk about, and I'll try to sort of relate them to the different SMB SKUs and how to achieve the capabilities. But if we take a look at the types of conversations you should be having with customers, so do you know who's accessing the data? Can you grant access to data based on risk in real time? Can you find and react to a breach? Can you protect data on devices in the cloud and in transit? Do your users, I like the way they've highlighted the word love. Let's just change that to enjoy their work experience. And then otherwise, this is where we need to start thinking, well, these are things that we need to be able to address. So there's definitely going to be opportunity in pretty much all scenarios here. So the four scenarios that we'll take a look at here are securing at the front door, securing the content, securing devices, and then that great employee experience. So securing at the front door is really where we have that identity-based conversation. For secure content, this is where it really starts to become more of an Azure information protection conversation. Securing devices, well, this is where we have to make a decision. Do we want to manage the device, or do we actually want to manage the data and the application based on the user identity? And then what type of self-service capabilities do we actually want to give the users? So let's jump in with securing at the front door. Now, you've heard Intelligent Security Graph mentioned already. I'm guessing, actually, I think this is probably the third time that we've spoken about it in this series. But this is really giving you that indication of just all of the different data points that Microsoft is pulling in when it comes to, what gets rolled into decisions around what Microsoft will do when you're trying to log into Azure Active Directory. So let's just keep this slide building through. So you get an idea that there's a fair bit that we can actually start learning from what's going on behind the scenes here. So this is the conditional access slide that you've seen variations of as we've been through the last few weeks. But let's talk about this from the SMB perspective and the common types of attacks that, let's say, an Office 365 customer might have. So generally what will happen, and any of you who've got an Office 365 customer who has had an account breached, and you've had to go through and look at, well, how did they actually get access? Generally speaking, you'll find that if it wasn't something where they were able to successfully get credentials through a phishing attack, and it was just some kind of password spray attack or something similar, generally you'll find that it's an extended time period for these types of attacks to take place. It's not something where they try to keep hammering away at a particular user and different password combinations until the account gets locked out. Instead, they'll be coming in from different IP addresses, from different regions, and slowly trying to just work their way into the system, just so that they can at least get their foot in the door. Now, depending on who you talk to or who you listen to in the Azure AD team, you'll either hear them talk about this being a minimum of 10 terabytes per day, or one of the last figures that was spoken about publicly is they'll actually also talk about it being up to 40 terabytes of data per day that's analyzed to help make decisions around what users can be granted access to. So let's just sort of talk about what the SKUs are that are required for this. So once we start talking about this conditional access functionality, this is something that comes in the Azure Active Directory Premium 1 SKU. So this capability is not included in your regular Office 365 subscriptions without anything else added. It's not included with Microsoft 365 Business. This is really like an AAD Premium conversation, an EMS conversation, or a Microsoft 365 Enterprise conversation. So the types of questions that get asked, so privileged user, the credentials found in public, etc. Well, some of these things that it's already looking at here, and as we get into the next section, there are even more, but some of these are actually things that start lighting up once you've got Azure Active Directory Premium P2 SKUs, not even just the P1 capabilities. But let's go through and see the next steps. So the user risk, high, medium, or low, and the session risk, high, medium, or low. So once we start looking at the risk factors that are taken into account, this is something that can only be done once you've got Azure Active Directory Premium RP2 licenses. Now that said, we can start, if we do leverage these, it means that we can start putting different approaches to how we react based on those. But also, if we take a look at the types of things we want to allow, so allow access, require MFA, force password reset, deny access, limit access. So some of the things that have been added into conditional access recently have been the ability for you to start setting not just IP ranges or IP addresses as trusted locations, for example, but also starting to target countries. So while you wouldn't necessarily automatically trust an entire country, for example, there are obvious risks associated with that. There are probably different rules that you want to put in place if it's something outside of the locations where you know employees of that organization actually are. So if you've got an organization that is like everything is done in Australia apart from maybe an executive travels overseas every now and then, well, all of a sudden you can start saying, well, if it's not Australia, how about we start making sure that things like, rather than just allowing access, let's start requiring multi-factor authentication as soon as we see anything suspicious. So what starts happening here is, for those, if you think about it compared to someone who doesn't have this functionality enabled, it means that rather than there being all of these behind-the-scenes silent fails to sign into your account, now they're not really silent because it's coming into log, it's all being logged. But the problem is if the log files are never looked at and never processed, then effectively it's falling on deaf ears. But what we can start doing here is once these types of connections start taking place, all of a sudden we can start getting a lot more insight into what's going on. Even if someone is successful in attempting to use a password, a valid password for a user from a location or a region that's not trusted, all of a sudden the user can be prompted for multi-factor authentication, which really should be a good indication that if someone's getting an MFA prompt, that means effectively that someone's already basically bypassed password security. And as we move forward, MFA, especially going down the path of authentic or things like Microsoft Authenticator rather than SMS-based MFA, really are the direction that we need to start taking people down. Now, some of the other options that we've got here, so things like forcing password resets. Now, probably not something you really wanted to do very lightly. Denying access, probably something that you definitely need to do. There may be certain workloads that people really shouldn't be trying to access outside of work hours, or outside of the work premises. And then finally, in some cases, apps will actually start giving you a scaled down capability based on what requirements you actually do meet. Now, some of the other things that start coming into play here, if we work through that if list, so privileged users, these are the ones that effectively we'd be also considering assigning as your Active Directory Premium 2 licenses to. An unmanaged device is a device that's not enrolled in Intune, for example, so we can't go through and see, is the device healthy? Now, that means in iOS, it means is the device jailbroken? In Android, it means is the device rooted? In Windows, does it mean is it a Windows 10 device that can pass device health attestation? And that way we can start, allowing access based on the trust level, not just of where the user is and what they're trying to do, but also the trust level that we've got of the device in its current state. Now, some of the other ones here, you've probably already seen things like impossible travel, where if we're trying to sign in from Sydney right now and then a few seconds later I'm trying to sign in from Singapore, that's the kind of thing we can also start flagging very easily. Now, one of the things that I mentioned here was that you did see things like safe links and attachments, or the Office 365 ATP capabilities, were some of the, generally speaking, some of the recommendations around things that are going to have a high impact on helping to protect SMB customers. So in this case, making sure that we can go through, we can do URL rewrites, we can basically keep redirecting through to a location to make sure it is a safe link. If something suspicious is found in an attachment, it can be sent off to a detonation chamber. They can figure out, is it actually a good attachment and a bad attachment in there, rather than it just being an attachment that someone decides to open. Now, when we start taking a look at some of the advanced Windows 10 capabilities, we start getting some of the advanced capabilities in Windows 10 Pro. Then we get more of them when we get up to Windows 10 Enterprise E3 and E5. But what Windows 10 Enterprise E5 also gives is really that additional reporting and action capability after the fact. So that's where we start leveraging Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. Now, this is something that if we just think about the additional security capabilities that a Windows 10 device can receive just with Win 10 Pro, that's already going to provide a lot of SMBs with more than they've already got. So it's already going to be a great step up from what they're currently doing, and that's one of the reasons why you do get that older Pro to current Pro upgrade in in Microsoft 365 Business. But once we start moving up the rank there, well, again, as I mentioned, you have to sort of determine, are they actually going to be, leveraging these additional capabilities? Is their hardware actually capable of even supporting some of these? So if they're running like an older platform that's 32-bit, well, they won't be able to leverage a lot of these because it's, they need to have 64-bit enabled for some of these virtualization technologies to work. Now, for secure content, this is a fairly common scenario where, if we think about in years gone by, we used to think about the firewall being the security perimeter. It used to be this nice solid line. But many years ago, that concept really was eroded, where we started going, well, what about people who are getting VPN connections back in? What about machines that have been off the network that come back into the network? We started seeing that, people thinking that was that the firewall was a great defense. It's like, well, no, it's a defense, but it's only going to be one of many. Now we've got challenges around what happens when we start using a variety of different cloud services, both authorized inside the organization as well as ones that are being used but effectively in a shadow IT type scenario. How can we start tracking what's going on once data leaves the organization? Now, we've got a couple of different ways that we can start approaching this. So part of it is detecting to make sure that once we start having it so that things like Office can automatically detect based on conditions that you've put in place. So it's like, okay, this is something that needs to be classified with this label, and we also need to protect it, including applying encryption, but also restricting who can do particular things with that. But then the other part of that is also around how can we actually track who's doing what with that document once it does actually start working its way outside of the organization. So if we take a look at the life cycle of a sensitive document, well, for now it's created and it may end up in a variety of locations, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. Now, this is where we really want the ability to be able to go through and start, detecting it across different devices, across different cloud services, even being able to detect what's going on with it inside of the organization. We want to make sure that if it's sensitive data, that we can classify it, that we can label it, that we can put protection policies, retention policies in place, and then it's making sure that we've got that data protection that then lives inside of the document and follows the document. So this means that things like our DLP systems, any other system that we need to integrate with, we want that data to be traveling around, basically within that document, and we want the ability to start tracing that as that document moves through different environments. So then finally, how do we do that? Well, this is where we start leveraging tools like we can use CAS to start tracking movement. We can use Azure Information Protection. We've got the ability to go through and track who's opened the document, where have they attempted to open it from, was the attempt successful or unsuccessful to access that. And then finally, what do we want to do with it? Do we want to keep the data long term? Do we need it to expire? Do we want to go through and delete it? So making sure that there's also some degree of data governance in place. For the device security, as I mentioned, we really get to choose here. Once we step up to using the full capabilities of Intune, we can either manage the device or manage the apps based on the user identity. So if we want full device management capabilities, remember that that's Intune, but not the subset of Intune that's included with Microsoft 365 Business it is for Windows, but it's not for iOS or Android. On iOS and Android, you get the second experience here, which is the managing apps and the experience. So everything is going to be controlled via the user profile. And what you also have to take into account here is that most of the apps that Intune can control in this way are effectively also that, I guess that by default means Microsoft 365 Business can handle this way. Really, it's Office mobile apps is really the best way to think about it. So if you've got third-party mobile applications that haven't put out releases that have been wrapped with the Intune 2.9 SDK, I think it is off the top of my head, then you'll find that they won't actually cooperate with this type of approach. So you may need full MDM that the standalone Intune or Intune as part of a suite can actually provide you. Now, moving on to the self-service capabilities. This is really about making it really easy for people to get single sign-on into multiple apps We've got Azure AD's pre-integrated app list getting really close to 3,000 now. So this is something that's probably the majority of what you need has been in there for a while, but every month you'll see additional updates around here are some new things that have been integrated. So even this in the March Azure AD list, I think there are another like 10 or 12 SaaS apps that were basically added to this pre-integration piece. Now the self-service, so being able to go through and do password changes, password resets, being able to do self-registration for multi-factor authentication are obviously really important things. Being able to do self-service around here are the things that I need access to around, other internal resources or other SaaS apps. And then finally working from anywhere. So once we get outside of the organization's trusted network, how can we go through and start having security that basically will only start, I shouldn't say interfering, that really should only show its presence when it needs to let us know that something unusual is taking place. So that's where things like conditional access start kicking in, where we can start setting up trusted locations as well as untrusted locations. So as we start getting ready to wrap up, and I can see that there's a few questions, or at least one question in here. So right now, if we take a look at some of the reasons why some of the types of conversations that you should be having to customers, if we're talking about it at an enterprise space, in some cases it's about extending their existing security scenarios to include some of these. But when we talk about partners who are generally servicing the SMB customer, it's about making security reviews part of the offering that your existing teams generally have. If you're a large enough partner or a large enough organization, there's a good chance that you probably can implement your own security-focused team. But in this case, I think what we'll see with a lot of the Microsoft 365 services as a whole is that the security element will just be, certain things will be done at certain points of the deployment process. There'll be some things that you'll start seeing pushed to really be recommended and enabled much earlier on in the game. So things like getting users registered for multi-factor authentication very, very early, rather than saying next week we implement conditional access, make sure MFA is working, just making sure that some of these are things that are implemented very, very early on in the process. So other pieces here is making sure that you're going through, even with like some of the entry-level Office 365 business plans, running things like the Office Secure Score, just to see what recommendations are being made that you can enable with the version of Office they've got. So rather than going, look, to get you secure, we need to move you all the way up to this level, start securing what they've got. And this is where something like Microsoft 365 Business does a great job of that. So other things in here is, over time, being able to go back, do reviews of their on-prem AD, doing reviews of Azure AD, making sure that there aren't objects floating around that shouldn't be there. So these are some of the things that, that we see time and time again. Even one of the things that I strongly recommend is, even if you go through and do something like add an EMS E5 trial to someone who's got no plan on deploying EMS E5, just so you can see what kind of things it detects around privileged identity management and the advanced identity protection, just so that you can see some of the recommendations. So it will let you know things like, get an indication of how many global admins have you got, how many people with different admin roles across the different services in Office 365 and Azure AD and EMS. So there are abilities that you've got there, and then in some cases you might decide that, look, some users may need this higher level of protection, but again, it's generally going to be, the higher value targets that you need to go to a much higher level SKU for in that SMB space. So what I'll do is just get to the last slide, which is the thank you slide, because I know we're sort of bumping up against time here, and I can see one question here from Tom, which is, when will IPv6 IPs be able to be added to the MFA safe location list? I haven't seen any public documentation or any public announcements around that one yet, so nothing to share just yet, Tom. So I guess if you've got further questions, please drop them in now, and more than happy to hang around, because I know that we definitely did start late. So more than happy to spend a bit more time online just answering some questions that you may have based on some of the conversations and recommendations that have been covered here. Okay, thank you, Kenny. So Kenny will follow up the AAD and IPv6 question. Now, that said, some of the IPv6 pieces are starting to line up in certain Azure services. So it's not necessarily that everything supports IPv6 yet, but yeah, obviously it's one of those things that moving forward, it has to be there. Okay, if there are no more questions, what I'll do is I'll reach out to Anna and get her to stop the recording.